This is Transparency, a podcast by Gender Dysphoria Alliance, hosted by Aaron Kimberly and Aaron Terrell. Each week we'll be joined by people who have personal or professional experience with gender dysphoria and physical transition. We'll also discuss how our trans experiences relate to the concept of gender identity. Join us for a compassionate yet heterodox approach to the question of trans.
Cath Lloyd is the daughter of a male-to-female trans parent. In 1987, her dad suddenly announced that he was going to undergo gender reassignment treatment. This was a total shock to the whole family, except for her mom, who had known about her dad's gender dysphoria for 10 years. There were no warning signs that Cath remembers. Once Cath finally got through her bereavement process for her dad, she wrote her book, When Dad Became Joan, to support other people going through gender reassignment. And here's our conversation with Cath.
All right, welcome back to Transparency. I am Aaron Terrell, joined as always by my co-host Aaron Kimberly, and we have Cath Lloyd joining us today. It's kind of remarkable that we haven't had this perspective on before, and so I'm really grateful that you're here to tell the story. Cath, is that you are the daughter of a father who transitioned, and so you got the transparent experience. So thank you very much for being here.
No, thank you for inviting me. It's really lovely to be here with you guys.
I was really happy because you had reached out to us to pitch the idea, and I'm really grateful that you did, because it is a perspective that, as Aaron said, we haven't touched on in our podcast, but I think it's a really important one. So I'm really happy to have you on today.
No, thank you. I mean, I saw your on Instagram, and I looked at your podcasts, and at first I wasn't sure whether it would be something that you'd be open to, but I thought, hey, if I don't ask, I don't get, do I? So I just went for it, and you responded, so I was really, really happy. Thank you.
And we're glad you did. So I was hoping you could just tell that. So obviously you wrote a book about it, and we'll link to that book. It's called was it When Dad Became Joan? Sorry, is that?
Yeah, that's right. That's okay. Right.
Great. And unfortunately, I have not read it yet, but I definitely am intending to do so. But if you could just kind of take us back, like how old were you? What time? What year was this? Just kind of to set the cultural context of that whole event.
Yeah, so you could say I wasn't a child. I was 23 years old, more of an adult. And it was 1987. And my dad summons me home, and I was really worried because I thought the last time he summons me home was when I was 18, and he found out that I'd been having sex with my boyfriend, and it was as if I'd killed somebody. So I was like, oh, what have I done now? Sort of thing. And then eventually, he came into the room and started mumbling away about thoughts and feelings, and then eventually he just said it. He said, Kath, I've discussed this with your mum, and I've decided to undergo gender reassignment treatment. And that was it. And I was really, really shocked. There were no clues, no obvious clues. I mean, when I think back, there might have been clues, but perhaps, myself and other family members didn't really tap into them. And I was so shocked, I laughed. And until I saw how hurt my dad looked, and then I realised that he was actually deadly serious. And I really didn't know what to think. And back in 1987, there was no Mr. Google to turn to. I didn't know anybody else's parents who transitioned. It wasn't talked about. When I was younger, there was a documentary on the telly about it, and I did wonder why we're watching this, but it was quite interesting. So just duly sat down and watched it. And then it was, well, this is a secret. you can't tell anybody. You can tell your boyfriend, who's now my husband. You can tell him, but you can't tell anybody else. And it was a case of, our family is quite a group of internal thinkers, and so we were all internally thinking, not really speaking to one another about it. And so that didn't help, that there was no communication. And then, the process seemed to progress really quite quickly. My dad wanted to stay, or Joan wanted to stay as male until my sister got married, because that was on the cards. And then as soon as she got married, then the transition started to move quite rapidly. And when I came home after that, I wasn't really sure whether I was going to see my dad or I was going to see Joan. And that made it really, really difficult, because my dad, back in the 1980s, had very alpha male hobbies, mountaineering, rock climbing. He did all the gardening, all the DIY, fixed everything, um, ran for fitness, and had a big beard. And so there were no real signs of Joan inside. And so that's what made it very difficult for myself, my sister, and other family members to adjust, because of that very alpha male looking person who'd been in our lives all of those years.
So it seemed very much like a change from one person to another kind of deal.
Yes. And it was, it's a dramatic change. And then, of course, seeing Joan go through the transition, the operations, the electrolysis, all the years of electrolysis, all the voice therapy. And I knew a lot of it was very painful. The operations, the electrolysis was very painful. We did have the press on the doorstep, don't answer the phone, don't open the curtains, this sort of thing. Let us know when you're coming home to check that it's okay, that there's nobody on the doorstep. All of these sorts of things that, living a private life we'd never experienced before. And so it was culture shock in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I imagine it would have been more of a shock, just that contrast between, as you described, the alpha male to this transition. I mean, I would think it would perhaps have been less of a shock if your dad had been a highly effeminate man, and it might have made more sense to you. But it must have been.
Yeah, I mean, a while before, and this is where I say perhaps the warning signs were there, but we hadn't recognized them, is that he did have his nose reduced. But when I asked, it was, well, I've never liked it. It is a family trait for a large nose. And, I don't like it. I've never liked it. I just want to feel more comfortable about myself. And it was sort of, okay, that makes sense. And then, but the real big one was the Adam's apple that I really couldn't get my head around, that having that made smaller. But it's one of those situations, back in, the 1980s, when you're a teenager, how much do you ask your parents something like that? And or challenge it. And we just didn't do that. My mum had known for 10 years before the rest of us. And she was carrying that information on her own for all of those years. And I just thought that withdrawal from social life was, to do with me and my sister being difficult teenagers, perhaps being a pain in the backside like most teenagers are. But she was she was protecting herself, her husband, her children, her job, her marriage, and it was how she dealt with it. It was how she could manage. But thankfully, my parents stayed together as companions and lived the rest of their lives together, which was a really, really important driving force for us as a family to stay as a unit. I really celebrate that fact, because if she decided to leave, it would have changed the whole dynamics of our family entirely, like a lot of families, that's like it has happened to a lot of families.
You said that when you were a teenager, she kind of withdrew into the background. Are you saying that's kind of like around the time that he came out to, or that that your dad came out to your mom? Was that? I guess I don't understand what was that impact on her? If it was still private at that time, what do you think her understanding of it was, or why the need to kind of withdraw?
I think she withdrew because I think she was perhaps frightened of people seeing that there was a problem, and but and being frightened of perhaps saying something out of turn. I mean, she was a very private person anyway, and she didn't really air her issues and problems with people, not even her closest family members. And so, when I was writing my book, I went and spoke to my mum's brother, and they had recognized there was a problem, but they didn't know what it was. They didn't know whether it was a health problem or a problem within the marriage. So some people had recognized there was a problem. But again, the majority of the time, people don't like to interfere in other people's relationships in their marriages, because it's private, isn't it? Unless you want to open up the conversation. So I think she was just being in protective mode, and trying to look after us all, take the burden of looking after us all and keeping us all safe. Hmm.
She kind of knew the public transition was ultimately coming. Is that the case, do you think?
Yes, but she didn't quite know when it was going to be. And then obviously, for my dad, Joan, that it couldn't be held on to any longer, because when my dad was telling me, he talked a lot about, if I don't do something soon, I might do something more drastic to myself. And it was all this sort of conversation before he actually told me that he was going to transition. And so, there was quite a lot of negative thoughts and feelings floating around, in conversation, while he was telling me. But obviously it was running really, really deep. And, he'd lived with these feelings for 45 years. So he knew that at the age of 5 that he was somehow different. But obviously at 5 years old, you don't really know what that is, do you? And so, I tend to say my dad became an expert in deception almost from the age of 5, covering up his true thoughts and feelings.
And as you said, there wasn't as much known back then about these things, and yeah, in the 80s, there was starting to be more people transitioning, but it was still fairly unknown. How did you and your family make sense of that experience? Like, what did you think that
Um,
trans was?
well, it my dad Joan was able to explain it very, very well. But I wanted to try and understand it. I wanted to try and understand why the brain was almost playing these games on somebody. And that's when I really, really struggled, because I just couldn't understand it. And and in the end, I just had to either accept it or not accept it, because there was no way I was going to be able to understand how the brain processes all of this. And it was a case of either, well, I lose this person or I don't lose this person. And I didn't want to lose this person. who was my dad and was now going to be Joan. And so it was a case of learning how to manage my thought processes so that I could accept it wholeheartedly. But I found it a really difficult process because, for one thing, I thought, well, if if I laughed when my dad told me, how were other people going to respond? And that's one of the things that frightened me about talking to anybody about it. But then eventually you learn that the majority of people are really understanding, and they're really flexible, and and accepting, and it's just a small minority of people who go against all of these differences in people, all of the diversity. But it did take me a long time because of this struggle with trying to understand it fully. Because I thought, well, if I understand it, it'll be easier. But I couldn't understand it, which made it more difficult in a way. Um, and and then just talking about it, I found really difficult. With new people that I'd never met before, and but gradually I did come to the end of that bereavement cycle of change and loss. And once I did, then it was a massive relief, a huge relief. And I had to really manage my thought processes properly because I ended up being the main carer for both of them for the last 5 years of their life. And so it was vital that I had to really accept it wholeheartedly with no doubts at all.
Was your mom able to reconnect with community after the transition? Like, did she stop withdrawing once that step had been made, or did she continue to withdraw from people?
No, what was really, really good is a lot of friends that sort of disappeared came back again, which was really, really nice. And at that stage, I don't really know how that worked because I wasn't, you know, in their pockets, so to speak, so much at that time because I was, organizing my own life, having my own children. But yeah, all of those friends came back, which was really, really nice. And there was a strong community, really strong community within the family and in their social life, which was really good. And my mum, managed to embrace some of Joan's trans friends as well, which was really nice. And because at one stage, as you can probably imagine, she found that really, really difficult. And you know, for my mum, and maybe a lot of partners who meet before transition, my mum hadn't, when she married, she hadn't signed up for this, and so it was a massive adjustment for in any relationship, a massive adjustment for her. And but I think what she found most difficult was that she wanted to be seen as a heterosexual and not as a lesbian. And I think that troubled her quite a lot.
You said that after the transition, you found that people were more accepting than not, and so this would be in the late '80s and early '90s. What part of England were you in? Because that's kind of a pleasant surprise, really. I would think that there'd be more of an adverse reaction at that time.
I mean, yes, there was an adverse reaction, and that's why the press were on the doorstep. But talking to people when I was, researching for my book, it was really heartwarming to know how supportive people actually were. And I think that they just found it difficult to perhaps talk about it, how to approach the subject, and felt awkward rather than them being,
Mm-hmm.
against what was happening. And I think as well, for a lot of friends, it was adjusting to the situation and being frightened of getting it wrong, being frightened of using the wrong pronoun. Um, but I tend to tell people who I speak to, well, if you get it wrong, just say you're sorry. And, you know, and they, the majority of time, they will accept that and you can move on. Because that's what I found, even 30 years later, I would still, to Joan go, oh, Dad. And then I go, oh, sorry, I'm really sorry. And she go, that's all right. And then we just carry on, we just move on. But I think it can be quite frightening at the beginning to, that you're worried about getting it wrong. And then, how do you address that you've got it wrong? Do you ignore it, or do you just come clean with it and be upfront about it and talk about it? Because I don't know how it is in the States, but, we're known for being a little bit more reserved here in the UK, and a
Yeah,
bit frightened of getting it wrong.
yeah, and it sounds like Joan was fairly gracious about that. If people made a mistake, that it was just a quick correction and move on. I think that's something that's changed in the more recent times, is this kind of militant expectation that everyone gets it right, and that you can change your pronouns multiple times a day and expect everyone to keep up. And that, I think that's really frustrating people, and that really, I think, interferes with relationship if people feel like they can't make a mistake, or someone's going to be angry.
Yeah. And you use the word can't keep up. And that's how I felt, that my dad had got a 45-year head start on me, and I was finding it really, really difficult to catch up. And it does feel like a catching up process, because, and this is probably the same for you, is that you'd spent years and years planning how you wanted to be seen, how you wanted to be heard, what the sorts of things you'd be saying, and how you'd be saying it. And suddenly we,
Mm-hmm.
as family members, of friends, we've suddenly got to jump into that. And that's why I say, it's a catching up process, and we have to catch up really, really quickly. And people make mistakes, don't they? Yeah, it's natural to do that, but then it's how you manage that afterwards, that's really important.
Yeah, and it's a ingrained habit. If you were, referring to this person as your dad for 20 plus years, and now suddenly that's changing. That's a very well established habit that needs to change, and that's gonna take time.
Yeah, that's right. And I found, at her funeral, with her eulogy, I had to address both sides of her life, because of course in the audience there were a mixture of friends there who had known Joan, all through adulthood, through the transition, and then there were friends there who had only known her since her transition or going through her transition, and 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 also for myself as well. And because both parts of her life were just as important to each other, and it all had to be addressed. Um, and so that was really quite tricky, but an important thing to have to do, um, to round her life off to the best that I could do.
Before you, when you're describing that transition, initially you were talking about like kind of bereavement and loss. Do you feel like, or at the time did it feel like you were losing your dad, or did it feel like this is just a change in my dad's life that I need to adjust to, or did it feel very much like you're losing one person and gaining another? I imagine somewhere in between, but
Different person. Yes. Well, yes, I did really, because of the drastic change, from visually, um, you know, tonality wise as well. And that's what I found really quite difficult. And obviously later, you could call me a slow learner, that I finally realized that actually, the conscientiousness was still there, the gentleness, the kindness, um, was all still there, but we spend so much time looking at the visual cues and the sound cues that it's difficult to see the more important stuff, their actual personality. And um and yes, and of course, Joan didn't want to be called Dad any longer, and I missed calling somebody my dad. My mum and my dad. This is the dad who, I'd sit on his lap in the evening when I was little. He'd come home from work, have tea, sit down for a little bit, get the paper out, which was massive in those days. And I would, crawl up his legs under the paper to sit on his lap, while he read the paper, just to have closeness time. And perhaps I felt that they were gone. But I remember, thinking, when my dad was telling me that, has the whole of my dad's life been fake? Does he love my mum? Did he really want me and my sister? Which I know sounds a stupid thing to say, because later on I found out that his little brother, who's 13 years younger than him, all he wanted to do was learn how to care for this baby brother. So, of course, that me and my sister were desperately wanted, but it was just these initial thoughts and feelings that were coming through, when I was first told. How real has life been for him so far, if this is how he's always felt?
Did anything emerge after the transition, like from did you see anything in Joan that was a change that you saw as a positive change? Was Joan happier than your dad, or did anything emerge from Joan's personality that you ended up really liking and appreciating?
Oh, there was lots of things. It makes me sound as if I didn't like anything about Joan at all. But but no, there were lots and lots of things. And the fact that, she was so good at, at being Auntie Joan with my children, with my nephews. And but that is just the part of Joan, my dad's nature, as a very caring person. And what was really what was really lovely for me was that when, she and my mum got their new marriage certificate, that I was actually there, spending a lot of time with them, seeing to their affairs and things like that. And so I was able to share that with Joan, with opening, um, her new marriage certificate. And it was just such a private moment that I was allowed to share with her. I felt really, really honoured. Unfortunately, at that time, my mum was quite severely, disabled with Alzheimer's, and so really didn't understand what was going on, what it was all about. But it, so for me to be there with Joan while she was opening it, she'd got somebody who could understand and respect her decisions, from all of those years ago, and celebrate the fact that she got her new marriage certificate that said Joan on it. So that was a really, really lovely time. And Joan never, I remember asking her the once, do you ever regret transitioning? And she just went, no. So it was the perfect thing for her to do. And, I really respect her for that she went through with it wholeheartedly. And it's just a shame that it had taken her so long to connect with her self-honesty and to do that transition, because it does make me sad as well that all of those years that she struggled with being in the wrong body, when she could have had a lot more better years. I'm not saying that she never had any good years as being my dad, but she could have had way more better, happier, contented years being Joan rather than my dad. And that makes me sad.
Was there anything?
But at least she transitioned.
Yeah. I mean, as a caring person that you describe her, she must have been aware that it was challenging for you and your mom. Was there anything that you remember her doing to support you through that process that was helpful for you?
Yeah, she wanted to talk about it. And she always said, you can come and ask me anything, which was good. But I really needed to speak to somebody who wasn't connected to it. And I didn't really do that until a lot later, when I was off work with stress. I eventually went and had some counselling, but it didn't work. It didn't work for me, because eventually, I think it was on the second appointment, I finally opened up and told the counsellor, what the real problem was. And her eyes lit up with glee, as if it was, oh great, this is my first transgender client, or this is my first client with transgender issues. And that just split the relationship between me and the counsellor, because I thought, this isn't going to work now,
Yeah,
because
you don't want to be her
she's not in
entertainment.
this relationship for the right reason. Yeah.
Yeah.
But then I went on a life coaching course, and that's what really helped me, because I knew what the problem was. I'd known what the problem was for all of those years. And one, it was admitting it, and then it was working out how to get to where I really wanted to be. And I went on one of those life coaching courses, 2-day weekends, like most people do. And when you're training to be a life coach, like a counselor, you've got to go through the process. And I think I spent most of the weekend in tears. I'm going home. This is, I don't like this. It's too difficult. Like most people do when they're struggling with their difficult thoughts and feelings. But I carried on, and that's what really, really helped me work out why I was having these thoughts and feelings. What benefits were they? What were the benefits of having them, and how did I want to really be thinking and feeling, and working out how to get there. And so it was the life coaching that really, supported me in moving through that bereavement cycle. Mm-hmm. Say that again.
Oh yeah, what was the time frame from the transition to you going on that life coaching course and kind of working through those feelings?
So I think it was the early 2000s. I went on the life coaching course. So it took me a long, long time to get there. And I haven't looked back. I haven't looked back, because what I learned from from challenging myself on those thoughts and feelings have now helped me through other difficult times. And this is what I say to people, is that it's really, really difficult, but you've got to, it's a pain barrier that you have to go through, isn't it? And it's really, really important to press through that pain barrier and challenge yourself so that you can learn and understand, what those thoughts and those feelings mean, what the aches and the pains are when you are really anxious and really stressed, so that you recognize the warning signs for when you go through them again, and learning good coping strategies, some that you use every day and some that you pick up and put down as and when you need them. So the learning curve is massive, but it needs to be done if you want to become a better person and be in more control of what you're thinking and feeling and how you're reacting to those thoughts and those feelings.
Have you ever spoken to anyone that's had a similar experience to yours, like from a family member perspective?
Yes, not formally, but informally, which has been very good. The other two ladies were a lot younger than me, and they, their fathers were showing a lot of signs of femininity, and so it was a lot easier for them. But it's so nice to speak to, wives who are really on board with the transition and really, really supportive. And it makes me realize how things are improving in the world of diversity, in the LGBT community, to make things. I know there's still a lot of hurdles to jump over, but I feel that things are definitely moving in the right direction. But still, we need to be able to talk to people and find the right people to talk to. But what I found from my book is that, you know, I've people who are transitioning have approached me because they've seen the book, or they've seen me on YouTube, and they've come to me, or they've read the book so that they understand their family members a little bit more easily. And that's been really heartwarming for me, because I thought perhaps they wouldn't want to read it, but they have done, and that's really great.
That is really, yeah, quite inspiring to hear. So you're saying that people who are approaching transition, reading your book, kind of to get a better understanding and a better perspective on what that's going to be like, maybe for their children or their spouse or whomever
Yeah.
is going to be impacted. Okay, yeah, that is really.
I find that heartening too, because I think, as you're well aware, not all families do survive a transition. Like, it often, I think probably most of the time, I don't know what the stats are, but my impression is most of the time it does rip apart families. And I would think that has a lot to do with the relationship that you all had prior to transition, the quality and strength of those relationships, and the skills that you all bring to those relationships. If people don't have those relational skills, or they're really emotionally distressed, and none of us act at our best when we're really distressed and in crisis. But how we navigate and treat each other through that grief and that change, and all of the complicated emotions that come up, it's easy to imagine how that would rip apart families, right? If people don't have the skills to express themselves well, and to maintain the relationships through the inevitable crisis that happens through such a big change.
Oh yeah, I totally agree with you. And also, with people who are transitioning later in life, the failed relationships that they've had prior to that, which again is to do with communication, isn't it? And not being able to open up to the partner and explain what the situation is. And of course then it has massive implications on people's confidence, self-esteem levels, doesn't it? In forming new relationships, after going through failed relationships. So it does, it has massive implications in a much broader sense. And this is where we all need to learn, isn't it? To be able to communicate and connect more efficiently, more effectively, and feel confident that we can have our voices heard. Well, especially for people transitioning, that they can have their voices heard. But on the other side of things as well, I can understand why partners may or would want to move on, because it's a massive shift, isn't it, in the dynamics of the relationship, and not and like I said before with my mum, she wanted to continue to be seen as heterosexual, and as far as I'm aware, they lived as companions, in the same house. But for a lot of couples, that wouldn't be enough for them. And they would miss out on the intimacy, the sexual side of relationships, and find it too difficult not to have that in their lives.
Yeah, that's
Did
a huge
oh,
sacrifice
go on, Aaron.
for just acknowledging the huge sacrifice that would be
Yeah,
for some couples.
yeah, that's right. But the others, but some relationships that's happened to, that I know, they've stayed strong. They've stayed as a strong relationship, but just not together. They've stayed strong as parents for the children, and work well as parents, but they just can't work well together as close partnerships, if you understand what I mean from there.
Yeah.
And so the children have been at the forefront of the drive of the relationship to a certain extent.
Did you notice a shift in when in Joan's because you're saying that your dad was into like rock climbing and running and was a DIY and whatnot. Did Joan adopt different hobbies and pastimes, or did those stick?
They did stick on a slightly less exaggerated level, um, and tried to do a bit more, cooking wise, things like that. But I think that's where my mum put her foot down and said, "No, that's my domain. You're gonna have to leave that to me." But no, as a couple, they were both heavily involved in walking, in the hills and in the mountains. So they were able to keep that going. And through the years, Joan did develop slightly different hobbies, photography for one. But that was really driven as well by, her love of the walking. And so use that as a way of being able to do a photograph, so that then she could use that for her other hobby. And I think it was just her attention to detail, her drive for perfection, that helped her with a lot of her hobbies. And in the local photographic group, she actually did really well for a number of years and won a lot of prizes. But even as a child, her drive for being, coming across as an active, athletic boy, again, reaped rewards with, my dad and his brothers winning a lot of sports competitions at school and things like that. And so that I think is a lot to do with personality that drove this desire to perfection and to perform well. Which had huge benefits for her. Does that make sense? Have I answered the
Yeah,
question?
yeah, no, it does make sense. Yeah, yeah. Also, I imagine age would have something to do with that as well. You know, you don't want to be, yeah, keeping up the dangerous hobbies well into your, 60s and 70s. I mean, some do. Kudos to them, but
Yes, I mean, when she got a lot older, she wanted her favourite mountain, Cadair Idris in North Wales, and she went up with her brother, and it was a real struggle. I think on the way down, my uncle had to carry both rucksacks and guide her down, and it was so we're never doing that again. Sorry, you'll have to find something different to do. I'm not doing that again. But yeah, her love of the mountains, her love of walking, her love of, you know, just watching films about mountaineering has always been there. She still loved watching the motor racing and the rugby, which isn't, which both all genders do now. It isn't. There's no gender. There isn't such a big gender gap with a lot of these hobbies and things that we enjoy now. Back, when she was a child, so it makes it a lot easier for people to transition and still do what they love to do. I know there's a lot of controversy, isn't there, around trans people going into their new gender to do their sport. I don't know what you feel about that.
Well, there are some fairness issues. If someone has a physical advantage because they're a lot taller and a lot stronger, it's we can't defy those biological realities. So we have to balance, social inclusiveness with fairness and safety.
But at least, that's only really with highly competitive, isn't it? For the average person, it's a lot easier to be able to continue to enjoy the sports that you like to do. Once you transition, thank goodness.
how did you come to the decision to write the book? What inspired you to write the book?
It was really on the day that I got through my bereavement cycle of change and loss. I remember it explicitly, and I talk about it in my book, that I was already, starting to sift through a lot of paperwork at my parents' house, 30 years of mortgage statements and all of those sorts of things that they didn't need anymore. And it was, I was having a fire and I was burning a lot of signatures and very private information. And suddenly I looked down into the flames and there was my dad's signature on something. And it felt like a cremation. I can feel it, the emotion now in my throat. And it felt like a cremation. And I suddenly had a massive panic that I had to save a signature. And luckily I found, another one of my dad's and my mum's, and I folded them up together and put them in my pocket, and I just wept. And once I'd finished weeping, I just felt a huge amount of relief and the burden had gone. And I just thought, if I've been struggling through all of these years, how many other people have been struggling as well? And that's when I started to think about writing, but then it still took me another few years to actually put pen to paper. Going through all the imposter syndrome and who wants to know about this, all of that sort of thing. But then, so I wrote the book in 2017, but it wasn't until when was it? January 21, 2021, and Joan was diagnosed with bladder cancer, that I suddenly got an email from a lady who had transitioned male to female, and she said, I found you on YouTube. I bought your book. It's really, really helpful. It's really, really helped me. And then the week that Joan died, I had another email of somebody saying, I've just read your book. This has been so helpful to me. Thank you. That I realized that I really need to press this. I really need to work harder at helping other people to manage big change in their life. Because if I struggled, how many other people are struggling? Not just with gender issues, but all sorts of big change that comes through life, and so that feeling of wanting, that feeling of wanting to support other people drove me to write it. So the first part of the book is really about how I did or didn't manage. I talk about how I told the children, how I managed at work, all of the times that I felt somebody was going to challenge me on, why do you talk about your mum and Auntie Joan? Why do you never talk about your dad? These sorts of things. And then the second part of the book is the 7 steps to living your new normal. It's the strategies I use to be able to get through it. And so obviously the story is very, very specific, but the 7 steps to living your new normal is open to anybody who is wanting to manage big change in their life.
It doesn't sound like the system was able to provide you as a family very much support. Am I correct in saying that? Like, is there support that you think you would have benefited from as an individual or as a family to help you move through some of those things more quickly?
I think I would have really benefited from just being able to speak to somebody in the early days who knew how I felt. Because, I felt very isolated. Just like with anybody going through massive change, you feel very, very isolated and alone and afraid, and you don't know whether your thoughts and your feelings are normal or abnormal. And you feel guilty for thinking these things, and ashamed. I felt very guilty and very ashamed about thinking a lot of these things, that I was a bad daughter, that I didn't deserve this person still in my life. But a lot of it is a process, is automatic thoughts, and you have to learn to accept them, acknowledge them and accept them and sit with them. And then, where do you want to go from there? But one thing I've learned a lot more recently is how to remove the story from that fact. And when you start to do that process, the fact is tiny, isn't it? My dad transitioned, but then I'd built this massive, great big story up about how it had affected me, because I'd put myself in victim mode. Look at me, look how it affected me. I don't know anybody else who's been through this. Why has it happened to our family? Why is my dad transitioning? Why, like I said before, was his life fake before this? And but being able to separate story from the fact it means that you can disconnect the emotion from the fact. And so that's been a massive gain for me, even all of these years later. And this can be about the argument that you have with your next door neighbour about the boundary line. It can be used in any situation, but it's a fantastic coping strategy to use to be able to, get right down to the nitty gritty of what the situation is.
Mm-hmm. It's a really good point. We all make sense of things through telling our story, so it's a bit of a catch-22. Like, we need a certain amount of story just to find meaning in any situation that we're going through, but we have to be really careful that the story that we're creating is factual and doesn't have these little distortions in it that are actually compounding the issue and making us feel even worse about it, which I think is what you're describing, right? That some of the little, narratives that you had inserted in there about, feeling like a victim in these various things were making that harder for you.
Yeah, that's it. And even years later, you can still have a lot of emotion attached to it. And it just means that you can remove yourself from it. And it's the situation isn't going to change, but it just means you can see it for what it is, rather than this great big rambling long process that you have developed around it. And yes, of course, you're right that, at the very beginning, you've got to make sense, like you say, of the facts and understand the story. But then it's how long do you allow yourself to tell this story and stay in victim mode and create all this emotional pain for yourself and probably for a lot of other people, and being able to separate it out gives you a rest, because it's tiring, isn't it? And this is what creates so much anxiety and stress, is that the emotional burden that we're putting on ourselves. And it just means that you can let it loose, and then you can free yourself up for better things in life, to think about, to feel, to enjoy, to work towards, rather than all of that that's gone in the past.
That seems very, broadly applicable to any family going through a crisis or a major change or major loss of any kind, right? Is that process that you went through, and how we're telling the story internally and what this means for us. I mean, families are so entangled with one another in hopefully healthy ways, but I mean, especially for kids, a lot of our identity is based on who our parents are and those family relationships. So when a family goes through a major change like this, the whole family has to reshuffle and change their own identities in some cases.
Yeah.
But hopefully as adults, we differentiate ourselves from our parents and the choices that our parents make. But I hear this from families of all kinds, whether it's a kid has an addiction, or the grief that the families go through, then the helplessness of the choice that one family member made, and the pain that ripples through the whole family. But ultimately, my identity isn't based on the choices that another family member makes.
Yeah, that and that's the important thing to remember, isn't it? That you have no control over other people. You have the control over what you think and feel about it. And it's understanding that, isn't it? But also it's about us as individual being totally honest with ourselves, so that we can hopefully at the end of the day then put our hand up and say, I'm sorry if you've made a mistake, or even, I'm sorry I hurt you, but I need to do this transition to be true to myself.
Mm-hmm.
And us being self-honest about how difficult our thoughts and feelings is us being um true to ourselves, just like my dad transitioning to Joan was she was being true to herself.
It sounds like your mom stayed true to herself too, right? That she maintained the boundaries of, just because my husband has made this decision doesn't mean that I have to change the fact that I'm a heterosexual woman and the kitchen is mine, so hands off. Like, it sounds like she had very good boundaries about those things, that she doesn't have to change her identity and who she is just because her husband has made this choice.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it was obviously exceptionally difficult for her, and she had to dig deep. I know she had to dig really, really deep and really connect with her values. And at the end of the day, it was, well, I married this person because I love and I respect them. And so staying with them means that I can continue to love and respect them the way I did when I first met them. And she taught me an awful lot about the importance of understanding your values and using them as a guide to help you um, through difficult times in your life. And so she was just as an important person. My mum was just as an important person in my dad's transition as Joan was. So that Joan could live successfully as Joan and still have her family around her. And and through COVID, me and my sister we were in a situation where we could look after them, keep them in their own home all through COVID, um, and to end of life, which um, and that shows the strength of us as a unit, as a family, that we were able to do that. And also, what was interesting is that we never had any problems with with the care system, with the health system, with Joan's transgender issues. Everybody was really, really good. Everybody was really, really respectful. And I don't see I never haven't seen that side of things that so many people talk about. It's all been very, very positive for us as a family and very, very supportive. And what was really nice, I'd take them before they got too poorly, I'd take them to a fitness class for Age UK. And I think that some people were unsure about my relationship with these two ladies. And this one lady suddenly perked up after a few sessions and she just asked me outright. And I said, "Oh no," I said, um, this is my mum and this is my other mum. And the lady went, "You're so lucky having two mums." And that was so lovely. And well, it just really, and I just went, "I know, I am." And and that was the level of respect that we had for us as a family. So that was lovely, really, really nice and heartwarming.
It's interesting to me how many, because so especially now online, obviously when you went through this experience initially, it was very, very rare. Like you're saying, there was nobody to talk to. No one else had gone through this to your knowledge. Well, obviously you knew people had, but you didn't know where they were, how to discuss it. Now, obviously there are online forums for every, experience under the sun, essentially.
Yes.
And there's all these certainly forums for people who themselves are embarking on transition. There's plenty for spouses. I mean, like a lot of the women who didn't stay with their husbands post-transition, who are, I'm sure you've encountered this, are referring to themselves as trans widows. And there's like these so many different like pockets of kind of communities. I'm wondering, is there such a community for children of transitioners? Is that something that you're acquainted with or aware of? I imagine with like your book being out there that, you know, people in this experience may have reached out to you, or you may be kind of in these communities at all. Is that such a thing? I feel like with transition being more and more common by the day, there should be like, again, like communities of the children of transitioners, but I just never hear that perspective.
Well, when I was, a few years back, well, not even a few years back, quite recently, I was, I was going on to Facebook groups, for example, and I was refused um, joining one group because I wasn't transitioning and I wasn't a parent.
Mhm.
And I haven't found one for children. So it's quite an interesting point that you brought up. Um, so no, it isn't there. Um, and it should be there. Um, and I don't really, on some of these Facebook groups, I haven't really seen any conversation from children of trans parents. And so that's a really important point. And this is another reason why I'm starting to talk about it more and more. Because just because we're children, it doesn't mean to say that we haven't found it difficult. And I actually did a TEDx talk back in October around this as well. And I was really surprised at how well received it was at the TEDx talk where I did mine, because they all run slightly differently. They did a Q&A at the end so the audience could ask some questions. And I had two very interesting questions asked, one from female to male transition, and then another question from somebody who I think had got a friend who was transitioning. And the questions were both around communication. How can how can we communicate with our parents, our family members more easily? What is it that they need to know to make it easier for themselves? And so, two very, very important questions that were asked. So it just goes to show, that we all need to learn about this, about, developing our communication skills and understanding each other and seeing it from other people, the other side, the other family member's side. And I know it's difficult for everybody involved, and it must be tremendously. I really appreciate how difficult it is for people who are approaching their family for the first time to bring the subject up. It must be heartbreaking to have to start the communication process off, but vitally important.
Mhm. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. It's been great to meet you and just hear about this great resilience of your family, that you were all able to
Thank you.
just continue loving each other through the challenges. And so thank you for approaching us in the first place, but thank you for coming on and sharing your story with us.
And thank you for listening to me and reading my message. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
We'll link the
Thank
TED
you.
Talk as well to the liner notes so people can check that out.
Oh, lovely. Yes, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Kath.
I'm going to stop recording. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Transparency Podcast. If you enjoy our content, please help out our algorithm by hitting like or subscribe. If you'd like to make a donation, follow the link to our PayPal account. On behalf of the Gender Dysphoria Alliance, thanks for your support.